Okay, hello everybody, and in about 10 to 15 minutes now, I'm going to give a very brief overview of some tips for how I think you can start to work across disciplines, and some things that you really need to bear in mind when you start to do this, because it's not easy, and it does require a few kind of fundamentals, if you like, and quite a lot of practice. So, get ready to cross the Rubicon. The first question that I want to ask is, what is interdisciplinarity? So it's a word that you've probably heard bandied around quite a lot, particularly in modern academic research. But what does it actually mean? And I'm not going to completely cop out here, but I do direct you to the literature. So throughout this whole presentation, for each slide, on the corresponding reference sheet, there are lots of references that I encourage you to go and read. Particularly with respect to this question, the answer of what interdisciplinarity actually is, there isn't one. There is no consensus, and different people will give you different answers. But what I'll do here is give you a high-level overview of common answers that I think nicely sum up the idea. So interdisciplinarity is, if you like, the integration of different content or perspectives or practices, such as methods, from different disciplines for a common research task. So that could be an overarching question, whether it's of fundamental importance, say to a given question, or maybe it's such a large question, a global question very often, but often this is true for local problems as well, that it requires looking at from many different angles. Now, in the sciences, I've put here that multidisciplinarity, if you like, reigns supreme. Now, multidisciplinarity, as opposed to interdisciplinarity, is the usage of several different disciplines, and this could be, in the sciences, it's typically because they have different methodologies or different methods, and they provide a piece of information which is helpful in answering a question. Interdisciplinarity historically has been more kind of at home, if you like, amongst the humanities, because those disciplines themselves are generally critically self-aware, and their whole kind of evolution is based on continually interrogating themselves and the methods that they use. This is sometimes done in the sciences, and I speak as a physical scientist, a material scientist, but to nowhere near the same extent. So the above two statements, those two bullet points, are a little contentious, and there are people who will say, well, you know, multidisciplinarity does happen in, you know, humanities and social sciences, and absolutely, yes, it does. And likewise, there is very good interdisciplinary and true interdisciplinary research done in the hard sciences as well. It's important to note here that although interdisciplinarity is something, it's a horrible word to say, it's something of a buzzword in academic research today. It's not a new idea. So you can look at subjects, for example, like classics, the study of the ancient world, geography, such a broad topic in its own right, and my subject, material science. They are very much what I would call interdisciplinary subjects in their own right. And increasingly, you're seeing that the cutting-edge questions that face, for example, humanity in various different, and society in various different guises, are requiring this interdisciplinary approach. So this table is just put there to sum up some differences between multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity again. In interdisciplinarity, we're looking at this idea of uniting different disciplinary methods and approaches, and the idea that you actually you integrate these ideas into one cohesive whole. Often in interdisciplinarity, you actually need to train up researchers in skills which transcend those disciplinary boundaries. So rather than just being trained in the traditional skills of one discipline, actually individual researchers need to be skilled across many things. And that's not easy. That is very difficult, not only from a training perspective, but also for the individual. And likewise, interdisciplinary research requires often you create these new research vocabularies which are not siloed in their individual disciplines. It's important to state here that, you know, people talk about interdisciplinarity as this wonderful solve everything solution, and it is a wonderful thing, and it I believe can solve many things, but it's not always the appropriate method to use for all problems. But I do know that for the program that you are on, and for lots of the work that I do, for example, it really is a solution. So I'm not going to talk anymore about kind of defining what it is, but rather I want to give you just 4 tips about how you actually go about doing interdisciplinary work. And these are kind of personal perspectives, but I think they're, from what I found in personal experience, they're really valuable. So they are reading and writing critically. There's some philosophical fundamentals that I think will really help. The importance of communication. This is really close to my heart, and this is something that I do a lot of work in. And finally, picking the right people, and more on that at the end. So, reading critically. Reading critically is the first step to writing critically, okay? And by writing critically, this is something which is very common in, for example, literature reviews in different subjects, but also when you're introducing studies in a given, say, if you're writing a paper or an essay of some sort. And writing critically relies on you comparing whether it's results or methods or insights from different studies against each other. And in that way, you are adding value then to what you're writing down. So you're looking at the broader literature and you're giving new insight. And you first have to be able to obviously read the material critically in order to write critically about it. So it's important here to note that being critical does not just mean being negative. It's about interrogating absolutely everything about what you read. What do we mean by that? So it's characterized, if you like, by you examine evidence or arguments that are made in a piece of work. You examine the influences on those evidence and arguments. You might examine the limitations of the research design or the focus of the research question itself. And also you examine the interpretations of the research that is done. So you might go through all of the, I come at this obviously from a slightly scientific perspective, but you would go through the methods, say for example, in some scientific research and the conclusions that are drawn from that, and you would examine those interpretations critically. Is basically, does it follow a logical progression? And then you need to decide to what extent you accept those arguments, the opinions, and the conclusions drawn by those researchers. Just quickly, I want to state here that thinking critically versus theoretically, I know from exposure to social scientists and humanities scholars that it's rather different to what we're trained up as physical scientists. So what I mean by critical thinking is kind of what's employed when you are synthesizing different knowledge. So I've put here Bloom's taxonomy, which is often used. It's different levels of how you might go about, for example, learning something. So you might just remember the knowledge before you then start to understand it, and then you can apply that understanding in different situations. You can analyze then new information, evaluate, and then finally the final step is to create new things yourself. And all of those steps up require critical thinking and what I would call objective and open-minded reflection. This is again linking back to that self-criticality which the sciences generally lack. So I compare this then to critical theory or thinking theoretically, which I know obviously as social scientists and humanities scholars you're probably very familiar with, and these ideas that were developed predominantly during the 20th century, but obviously before slightly as well, and some examples are there. So I just put that on because the delineation between thinking critically and theoretically is not a delineation that's made to scientists. So if you work with physical scientists, that's probably worth knowing. Okay, so we get on to the second point, philosophical fundamentals. I won't linger on this too much, and again, I'll post on the resource list some interesting articles for you to investigate. But there are some, if you like, some philosophical underpinnings which I think it's really important for anybody who works across disciplines, whether that's multidisciplinarily or interdisciplinarily, that they really need to understand in order to function effectively. So I start here with the idea of metacognitive scaffolds. This is from some published work, not my own, of somebody else's, which I've posted in the resource list. And it's important that you try to understand how different disciplines construct their knowledge. So this is really the content of those disciplines, what they study, and how they study that. So what methods they actually use. You cannot gain an appreciation or work, basically, across different disciplines if you do not understand those two fundamentals. And that gives rise, if you like, to the third fundamental of each separate discipline, which is its epistemology. So that's, just very briefly, I suppose, very generally to describe it, it's kind of, if you like, worldview, which is absolutely very much born from, or born of, the content and methods that those disciplines use. And different disciplines, right, have different epistemologies, and so there is often friction amongst them, or between them, which can cause problems between the scholars who are working in those different disciplines. Likewise, there are different ontologies in different fields often. So this is how information and knowledge is classified. So say, for example, in chemistry, a classic ontology is the periodic table in itself. So the fact that we are able to classify elements in that way. Now, different disciplines, so the periodic table is, you know, I'm going to get this wrong exactly how old, but close to 2 centuries, if not slightly older. Close to 2 centuries old, and so that's quite mature. But other disciplines are do not have as well defined ontologies, and this is something which, when you are or not as well defined ontologies, but similarly maybe different ontologies for the same kind of subset of knowledge, and that can cause some issues when you are working across disciplines. And finally, this idea of different theories. So in the resources, there's a lovely diagram explaining what different theories, theoretical outlooks, and also epistemologies and ontologies different disciplines typically use, and when and why you might want to use them. So I've put here, you know, you've got positivism and structuralism and their positivism and post-structuralism. They each approach questions in different ways, and having an awareness of that and which disciplines often focus on different theories is really, really important. So, linked to all this, you're probably now kind of realizing, is the idea of communication. And because of all of these different theoretical underpinnings, different disciplines might use the very same words to mean completely different things. This is something which I'm particularly interested in, and I'm starting a project this summer. But it can cause a lot of confusion, and confusion does not lead to successful interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research. So there are 2 ideas I've posted in the resource list again, these fundamental really literature which introduce these ideas of trading zones. So these are subcultures that develop within different disciplines, particularly within scientific disciplines these scholars were looking at, which develop their own, I've put here pidgins and creoles, effectively their own languages of sorts, which are only known to experts in those fields. And that then gives rise to the idea of interactional expertise. And this is something that you need to try and garner as somebody working in interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work. The ability to use the language of experts in another field without necessarily having, if you like, the practical expertise of being able to do that research. And this is what's dubbed interactional expertise. And it's basically just an ability to then communicate fluently and meaningfully and in depth with experts in that field. And finally, one that I've included here, which is often overlooked, is the idea of empathy. You simply need that ability to stand in someone's shoes, much like from To Kill a Mockingbird. You only really know when you walk around in another man's skin. And without that, you can't get anywhere. There are some interesting overlaps here with theories. I've put here methods, but theories as well in deliberative democracy and deliberation. And I'll post a few of the links in the resource list, because only by being able to sit with people and understand where they come from, which, you know, goes back to these ideas of the philosophical underpinnings of each discipline, will you be able to make any progress. And this then finally links really to my final point, which is you need to pick the right people with whom to work. So there's the famous, well, I don't know if it's actually his, but the Jeff Bezos rule of any meeting should only have enough people basically to be able to share 2 pizzas. If you require more pizzas, then there are too many people. This goes then in the world of business. It's often used to say when you start a startup, you should be able to feed the whole team with either 1 or 2 pizzas. Depends how big your pizzas are. But the point that I want to make here is that you should take a similar approach, but in terms of with the people that you work with, are they the people that you actually get on with? Will you be able to sit down and have a pizza with them and discuss these things? I'm not saying that you have to be, best friends with them, but it really helps if you find people who are aware of, again, like I say, these philosophical underpinnings of different disciplines. They are empathetic in their approach, and they are willing to learn different languages. And that is how you will start to succeed at working across disciplines. So I wish you all the best of luck in this work. Please do feel free to contact me. My details are here. I do have a Twitter profile, but not that active. And yes, good luck with the rest of the programme.